In this week's In-Ear Insights, privacy regulations are cranking down. Social media is in total disarray. There's chaos and controversy everywhere. And yet, we are still being asked as marketers to be able to offer personalization, customization, provide a single view of the customer, show a great customer experience, but our ability to rely on data that is clean, that is working, that is useful continues to diminish. So, Katie, how do we customize our content without data about people to build on that?
Well, I think that we should, be clear about what that means. And so, this is something that, I've always said, like, the cookieless future, it's going to be a problem for like the lazy marketers who only rely on that information. But if you are talking to your customers, if you're doing feedback surveys, if you're mining your CRM data for support information, then you're not going to have a problem. And so when we talk about the data exists. It's just a matter of whether or not you're going to put in the effort to from people. And that I think is then becomes the difference. So if you want to, customize your content. So we as consumers now with, the where technology is, have this expectation of personalization of everything. We don't want to give up our data, but somehow we also want to make sure that it's an experience that's unique to only us. And so the way in which that happens is by the consumers being willing to give feedback about themselves, what they care about, what they like, what they don't like. And then you as marketers have to be willing to take the time to not only collect that data, but do something with it. And so I think what we're talking about is in order to customize your content without the data that you're used to collecting, somebody shows up at your website, you cookie them, you follow them all over the internet, that's going to go away. You won't be able to get that. Social media is a hot mess. You can't just mine people's social handles and say, okay, it looks like they care about these 5 things. You actually have to talk to people. And that takes time, that takes effort, that takes relationship building. But by starting that process, that's how you're going to be able to customize your content.
Why don't marketers talk to people?
It takes time. It's not something that you can immediately see monetary results from. And so it's something that it's almost like a sunk cost, basically. A sunk cost is something that you're willing to invest in and not necessarily see return either right away or ever, but it's an important thing. And so talking with people, talking with customers is typically considered a sunk cost where I don't know what I'm going to get from it. But if you do it in such a way where your only agenda is to listen, is to understand what people like about your company, what they don't like, what they need, what they don't need, then it's not just going to be a sunk cost. It's actually going to be a longer term investment that you can then start to incorporate into your services, into your user experience, into your content, give people what they want. But you won't know what that is until you actually stop and listen and take the time to talk to people.
I guess I'm still stuck on why people don't do this, though, because we've done obviously focus groups and market research and stuff with folks in like the analytics from marketers community and showed them our reports and stuff and found that the feedback we got was super valuable, like really helpful and very informative. And it didn't cost us any money. I might have bought gift cards for folks.
But it cost us time.
It cost us time, but it again, like you said, it's an investment. So why wouldn't people want to do more of that? Because it's also, I mean, granted, people don't hate us, but it is also fun.
Not every company has a clear-cut community where they know that they can go to ask their customer base. And so, think about a brand who their only external asset is maybe social media. So their only external asset or way of reaching people is Twitter. Well, right now, that's not a great place to be reaching people because of everything that's going on that platform. And so if you don't have a community where your like-minded customers and prospects and audience can gather to talk about things, then it's harder to find them. If you are just a transactional company, for example, then your customers might be, a 1 or 2 time customer, and then they just kind of go away. if you aren't collecting the data in such a way in your CRM that you can actually look and say, here's who the customers are, here's, the profile of the customer. I mean, you have a myriad of reasons why people aren't doing it. And a lot of it comes down to they don't know how to reach out to people. But then the other side of that is you might have a lot of fragile egos in leadership and they just don't want to hear the negative either. Um, when I was a product manager, we wanted to do a voice of the customer initiative because we thought it was important to figure out why we weren't selling more of the product. We wanted to talk to the customers, and the decision makers, they were not interested in hearing any of the feedback that contradicted with their vision. So instead, they were like, well, let's get our most expensive customers and set up a big steak dinner in downtown Boston. And surprise, surprise, nobody showed up because that's not what they wanted. It was completely contradictory to the fact that our audience, our customers, made little to no money and were completely burnt out. So inviting them to a big ass steak dinner where we weren't going to listen to them anyway just was the absolute wrong way to go. But it fed the ego of the decision maker to feel like they were taking action.
So in situations like that, what are the legal and ethical ways to get around that situation?
The legal and ethical ways. So let's say you have a customer list. Let's say you have a newsletter list. Let's say you have a CRM with email addresses. As long as people have opted in to be contacted by you, you can send them a quick survey. How are we doing? Are you happy? Do you hate us? What's going on? And you can send them some you don't even have to get on the phone with them. You can just give them like a 1 to 2 click survey to say, hey, how's it going? Or you can even say, hey, we want to hear more from you. Are you willing to talk with us for 5 minutes? And make it worth their time. Because what ends up happening is if you set up some sort of feedback loop, but then that feedback to the customer feels like it just kind of goes into the void, they will stop being willing to give you information about their experience. So not only do you need to set up that feedback loop, you have to demonstrate that you're taking action on it. And that builds that trusting relationship. And that, Chris, is some of what takes time that companies are like, no, I don't have time to do that. Let's just, take that one piece of feedback and run with it and assume that everybody wants it because they want to make money right away. They have numbers to meet. Taking the time to do some sort of voice of customer doesn't help you meet your numbers immediately. It's a longer play.
The thing that I keep coming back to though is like that's not super hard to do. To ask people like a question in a newsletter. It's one of the easiest things in the world to do.
Right. But if you think about the ego side of it, you, Chris, are someone who are comfortable with getting constructive feedback. Myself, I am as well. Not everybody is. They don't necessarily want to know. And it can be a scary thing, especially if you feel like maybe your job is on the line, if you get too much negative feedback. Like, hey, salesperson, everybody is rating the sales experience with you as a 1 out of 5. So are you okay with that feedback? Are you willing to change? And if not, maybe we should find a different role for you or a different company for you.
Right. I want to just show an example of how straightforward this can be, because I think it's useful as an illustration. So in every month in the Trust Insights newsletter, we have this one-click poll, and you tap on one of the 3 answers. That's it. There's literally nothing else involved, and you get to see a picture of Katie's dog when you're done.
Which is totally worth it. Trust me.
It is. I'm not going to show it because you got to fill out you got to complete the poll to do it. But then what we do is we bring that data just goes into Google Analytics, Google Analytics 4. And then on the back end, we process that data. And it's basically the percentage of people who clicked they're likely to recommend minus the percentage of people who clicked they're not likely to recommend. That's the equivalent of what net promoter scores look like. And we just have a real simple piece of code that talks to GA4 and says it does those computations and puts it together as a single bar chart. And so you can see, once I started to remembering to put it into each month's newsletter, which took a few tries, you can see that over time that number has gone up and down. September was not a great month for us. It was the people who were I don't know what was going on in September. Maybe it was budget planning or something like that. But clearly October we rebounded to being very close to the 0.5 line, which is considered a great. And then November so far from this past week's news, we're at about at a 0.3, which is again it's good. It's better than where it's been for most of the year.
But I think that, so you said something, interesting. So in September it went down and you said, but I don't know why. And so yes, companies can run like a one-click poll, but without the additional context, this doesn't really tell them anything. And this, I would say, is really hard to make a decision on. We don't know what we're doing right. We don't know what we're doing wrong. We maybe only had one person respond to that survey, and this is how they responded. Like all of that information isn't being shown on this single bar chart. And so then what takes the time, where the investment is to start to investigate, well, what happened? Why is it down? Like how many people responded? Were they the same people who have responded previously? I think one of the pieces of feedback that we saw when you shared this was people said, oh, well, I'd responded before. I didn't think I needed to respond again. And so that's a cue for us to change the wording to say something along the lines of like, this is a repeat, like, has your mind changed or something like that. But that additional context, getting that is what takes the time. That's the investment. So, let's say we had 10 people say no. Our due diligence now includes reaching out to those 10 people to find out why, but then also doing something about it. And so maybe it's what we don't want to hear, but we need to hear it in order to continue to grow and move forward. But that's what takes the time.
Gotcha. So our next steps then will be to by the way, every bar in here represents a minimum of 25 responses. That's because I had issues with, there were some like clicks 3 months later. It was like, that's not really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's a minimum of 25 responses. So then we would have to go and essentially build focus groups out of the selections of people who did respond.
Right. And so what you're starting to describe is a larger process that we then have to set aside the time. We have to be okay with our resources being put toward that versus something that might have a more immediate but short-term, conversion. And so you're starting to, pick apart why companies don't necessarily do this.
So what would be our next steps? Should we put together a focus group of the folks who said no, or should we sick the sales team on the people who said yes? They recommend us. What are our next steps? Because this is the heart of personalizing. We have the individually identifiable data in our marketing automation system. What do we do?
I think we ask people why they responded the way they did. And that doesn't necessarily need to be like a big elaborate focus group. I mean, that, we are a small company. We don't necessarily have the time to dedicate to that. Like, yeah, we want to know what people want, but in terms of efficiency, we could start to position that one-click survey. If you said no, would you mind, in so many words, telling us why you feel that way? Or if you said yes, could you help us understand, what it is that you would be recommending? And so there's ways to include that context and that follow-up information without it being, a big, elaborate, expensive strategy. You can simply send a follow-up and say, you took the time to respond to this. Would you mind giving us, a few more minutes of your time to help us understand why you responded the way that you did?
Okay. I mean, that seems like a pretty straightforward thing to do. Again, it goes back to the original question of, how do you customize content without the data? It now seems like we actually have the data. We've had the data all along, it seems like.
Mm-hmm.
What, besides obviously 40 hours in a work week and not being willing to work evenings and weekends, what would prevent us, or what prevents another company from taking these actions? The egos aside. Let's put egos aside.
Egos aside, I mean, it may just come down to, making this a priority. And so, it's hard to talk about this without bringing the ego back into it. But a lot of times, a company will have a vision set by people who are so far removed from the actual customers that it's just such a mismatch. And getting them, the decision makers, to change the vision or change the tactics or change the strategy based on the data that you've collected, saying, well, actually the customers are saying this. Well, I can't go back to the board now and tell them that we're doing something different. Those numbers are already set in stone and they're going to hit the stock market and, whatever the thing is they do with the numbers. And so there may be red tape issues. There may be process issues. There may be, you know, the ability to get things decided upon then has to go through 6 different committees just to say, hey, but this is what our customers want. So then by the time you get around to making that decision of, yes, let's go ahead and give the customers what they want, 2 years have passed and the customers don't want that anymore.
Right.
And so it's the ability to make it's the ability to be agile with that data as well. And a lot of companies aren't structured that way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The other thing that I guess we could look at would be behavioral data, right? So what pages do people visit on a website? You don't need any personal identifying information for that. You can literally just use your web server's logs and say, okay, these are the pages that get the most traffic. Or if you are a little fancier at dancing, you can just do machine learning models to say these are the pages that nudge people towards conversion the most. Again, you don't need a whole bunch of personal information for people. You need none at all. You just need to know, can we identify someone anonymously and then build profiles of where they visit? And then for those people who convert, what's the difference? What are the pages that they visit that the people who don't convert either don't visit or don't visit as much?
Well, and I think that that's important too, Chris, is what data do we have? So obviously we can look at what pages they visit, but also within Google Analytics, if you're using that as your website tracking tool, there is interest data. There is, what keywords people were searching for when they found you or didn't find you. You have your SEO data. You have different tools for that. There's a lot of tools that you already have that can help make that personalized content. And so it's less about, I think you need to rethink what personalization means. And so it doesn't need to be every individual experience. Like, good morning, Chris. I noticed that you just took a sip of water. I thought I would serve you up this content. Like, that's probably a little too far in terms of the personalization, but I can, take a look at, a standard, sort of broad stroke profile of someone like you and know that you care about the latest cutting edge technology. You care about things like, the ethics of artificial intelligence. And so how can I help serve up that content to you?
And to your point, there is just good old fashioned asking people, what would you like to see more of?
That you're never going to be able to get away from that. That is always going to be the best way to get that data about how to personalize. And so if you're not asking people, if you're not asking customers, even if you're just putting out polls on social media that say, hey, would you be interested if we did this? Give it a shot. But that's what it comes down to. So, we've talked a lot about the cookieless future and being able to track people and being able to reach people where they are. I say, okay, that's fine. That's just lazy marketing. And I'll keep saying it, because if there's nothing wrong with using cookies, but if that's the only thing that you're using to reach your potential customers, then that is what's lazy.
Yep. And again, if you ask people, you'll figure out who influences them, what YouTube channels, what TikTok creators, etc. And in doing so, you may not be using programmatic advertising and just doing mass media buys to a billion people anymore, but you might be able to get more targeted customers that are behavior based with that. So, for example, if you happen to know that your 10 best customers all watch Google Foods on YouTube, the guy does like tons of grilling steak, and you run a sponsorship with him, you might catch additional new audiences that you didn't know you had because you previously were relying on things like age and gender and general interest. And instead, Google's audience could be a whole bunch of people, including some people you would never expect would be in that audience. Like, there might be a whole cadre of Catholic nuns who are really into grilling, and you would not think to advertise to those people. But by picking a channel where from asking your audience, hey, this is where we spend our time, you can reach them and bring in new people who might also have an affinity for the product or service you sell.
So, Chris, have you started to wrap your head around why people don't do this?
I mean, it's the same reason I don't do it, because I'm not willing to invest the time. Oh, no, I mean, seriously, like for my Almost Timely newsletter and stuff, I personally am not willing to invest the time to do it because to me, it is not a priority. I'd rather play Minecraft on a Saturday night than do that. But clearly for companies, I can also, we've both had those clients who were fact resistant. They were fact resistant clients who did not want to hear that their brainchild was actually a terrible idea.
And I think that's a lot of what it comes down to, is that fear of getting feedback that you don't want to hear. I'm personally someone who appreciates getting constructive feedback, because I'm always looking to improve and do better, and give people what they want, whether it's from me or from my company. And so I'm always seeking out that feedback, but that's not how the majority of people or companies operate. They're not always looking to improve themselves or their company. They just kind of want to like put those blinders on and do the thing, because not everyone has the confidence to take that feedback and be okay with it, and know that, to be able to pull out what's personal and what's not personal. So if someone says, hey, I thought the talk that you gave at Marketing Profs was terrible and it was totally off base of what I expected, I can take that personally or not. And to me, that's not personal, because if the majority of people who showed up for that talk that we gave got what they needed out of it, then that means that that one person they were having a bad day, or that's not what they needed. And I can't internalize that to say, how could I, make that one person feel better? It's, how can I focus on the majority of people who did get what they need out of it? And that's something in terms of like being able to take that feedback that companies need to be able to do, of, if you're looking to like pick fights with people on Yelp because they left you a bad review, you're probably not in the right headspace to be taking that customer feedback. And so you have to remove emotion from that feedback. You can't get defensive every time someone goes, I thought this was going to be about Google Analytics. Why are you talking about Twitter? Well, and then if you start like sort of jumping down their throat, like it's the wrong way. So it's the confidence, it's the openness to be able to hear the feedback, and then it's the willingness to do something with the feedback.
All right. Well, if you have feedback that you would like to give us, pop on over to our free Slack group. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and almost 2,900 other folks are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is you watch or listen to this show, if there's a platform you'd rather have it on, chances are we probably have it, assuming it hasn't been canceled. Go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast. And if you happen to be on one of those platforms, please leave us a rating and a review. It really helps share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.